A forgotten election that quietly changed America. At the time, it barely registered. No dramatic speeches etched into memory. No images replayed endlessly in textbooks. No clear moment when people realized history had shifted. The election came and went, recorded in archives, footnotes, and faded headlines. And yet, long after it was forgotten by the public, its consequences continued to unfold, reshaping America in ways far more profound than anyone anticipated. This was not an election remembered for passion or outrage. It was defined by restraint, fatigue, and a sense that nothing truly decisive was at stake. Voters showed up, cast ballots, and returned to their lives believing the system had functioned as it always had. Power changed hands quietly, or in some cases barely changed at all. The nation moved forward without pausing to ask what had really been decided. That quiet is what made it powerful. Elections that shock tend to provoke response. They generate debate, reform, backlash, and adjustment. This one did not. Its outcomes felt incremental, almost procedural. There was no sense of rupture, no urgent call to reassess assumptions. Precisely because it felt routine, its deeper effects were allowed to settle unnoticed. To understand why this election mattered, we need to look at what America looked like before it happened. The country was not calm, but it was stable enough to believe stability would last. Institutions still commanded respect. Political norms still held. Disagreements existed, but they were largely contained within familiar boundaries. The assumption was that elections adjusted direction slightly, not fundamentally. That assumption shaped expectations on every level. Voters expected continuity. Parties expected alternation. Institutions expected compliance. The system was trusted not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. That familiarity masked emerging vulnerabilities that had not yet been tested. This election challenged that assumption without announcing the challenge. Instead of producing sweeping mandates, it produced subtle shifts. Instead of bold ideological change, it altered incentives. Instead of dramatic reform, it reweighted power quietly, moving influence from one place to another without ever saying so out loud. Voters focused on personalities and short-term concerns, unaware that structural dynamics were being rewritten beneath those surface debates. The shift was not visible in speeches or slogans. It was visible in margins, in turnout patterns, in who stayed home and who showed up, in which coalitions held and which fractured. These signals mattered less to the public than to strategists, analysts, and party leadership, and those groups paid close attention. One of the most significant outcomes was not who won, but how they won. Margins were narrow. Coalitions were fragile. Turnout patterns shifted in unexpected ways. Certain regions gained influence while others lost it, not because of new laws, but because of how participation aligned. These shifts seemed technical at the time, interesting mainly to analysts, but they set precedents that future campaigns would build upon relentlessly. Political parties noticed immediately. They studied the data. They mapped turnout. They analyzed messaging resonance. They identified which voters could be ignored safely and which had to be mobilized aggressively. What worked in this election became the blueprint for the next. And once those blueprints were repeated, they stopped being experimental and started becoming doctrine. The forgotten election quietly taught politicians how to win in a new America, even if voters never realized the lesson had been taught. This is where the real transformation began. Campaigns stopped trying to persuade everyone. They learned to mobilize specific segments with precision. Appeals narrowed. Language sharpened. Broad consensus gave way to targeted intensity. The goal was no longer to unify, but to activate. Victory depended less on expanding agreement and more on maximizing turnout among the most responsive groups. This shift did not arrive with fanfare. It felt efficient, rational, data-driven. But it changed the emotional contract between citizens and democracy. Politics became less about shared direction and more about competing mobilizations. The middle did not disappear, but it stopped being courted. The election also altered expectations around legitimacy. Because the outcome felt unremarkable, few questioned it deeply. The process was accepted, but not celebrated. That acceptance masked fragility. Confidence in institutions remained, but it thinned slightly, just enough to matter later. The election normalized razor-thin margins and contested narratives without fully confronting their implications. Over time, that normalization had consequences. Future elections would inherit these conditions and amplify them. What once felt unusual became routine. Disputes became expected. Trust became conditional. The forgotten election didn't break the system. It loosened it. It taught America to live with ambiguity rather than resolve it. Another quiet shift occurred in governance. Leaders emerging from this election governed cautiously. Their mandate felt limited. Bold action seemed risky. Compromise became harder, not because it was rejected outright, but because coalitions were too fragile to sustain it. Power existed, but it was constrained by the knowledge that it rested on narrow support. This changed how policy was made. Instead of long-term planning, short-term survival dominated. Decisions were framed around the next election rather than the next decade. Incrementalism replaced vision. Gridlock was not a failure. It was a defense mechanism. The system learned to stall rather than risk collapse. Voters felt this shift even if they couldn't name it. Politics grew less inspiring. Participation became more transactional. Trust eroded slowly, not through scandal, but through disappointment. The sense that elections produced meaningful change weakened. Cynicism did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as apathy. This is why the election faded from memory. It did not shock the nation. It numbed it. The forgotten election quietly taught Americans that outcomes could change without direction changing. That power could shift without progress following. That voting mattered, but perhaps not in the way people had been told. That lesson lingered long after the candidates were forgotten. The deeper consequence was cultural. Citizens began to disengage emotionally even as they remained formally involved. Politics became procedural rather than aspirational. The national story lost coherence. People stopped expecting elections to resolve tensions and started expecting them to manage them indefinitely. Historians later recognized this election as a hinge point, not because it caused immediate transformation, but because it altered trajectories. It bent the arc of political behavior just enough that future conflicts became harder to contain. When polarization intensified years later, the groundwork had already been laid. When trust collapsed, the supports had already been weakened. The forgotten election did not create division. It normalized it. And normalization is powerful because it removes urgency. Problems that feel normal rarely feel solvable. They become background noise, tolerated rather than addressed. The climax of the story is not a single event, but a realization that came much later. When America finally faced its political fractures openly, many assumed they had appeared suddenly. In truth, they had been forming quietly since this election, protected by the illusion of normalcy. By the time the consequences became impossible to ignore, the conditions that produced them felt irreversible. Habits had formed. Strategies had hardened. Expectations had shifted. The system was no longer designed to heal. It was designed to endure. This is the legacy of the forgotten election. Not a villain, not a hero, but a quiet turning point that reshaped how power was contested, how trust was allocated, and how Americans understood democracy itself. The resolution is not nostalgia for what came before. It is awareness, understanding that some of the most consequential moments in history do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine, and only reveal their importance once alternatives have disappeared. The forgotten election that quietly changed America did not demand attention. It waited, and by the time its influence was clear, the country was already living inside the world it had created. A forgotten